start recording. And I am going to open up this. Actually, I want to open up a few things. So, I'll also go ahead and pull my, yeah, there we go. There we go. Okay, so we're still working on this thing. Before we jump into this, I want to talk just a minute about some other things. Namely, if we go to the D2L page, a couple of things, like kind of quickly, is our schedule, just as a reminder of where we are. We are on the 26th. That puts us right there. Which means I kind of shifted some stuff around a little bit. So it's saying we're supposed to be working on the punch today. We'll work on the punch tomorrow. And I have this thing set up on Tuesday for a critique where I was going to have y'all do the, we may do that. What I may do is next class period we may do the punch and the jump, and then we'll use the fifth as the discussion board critique where everybody can give some feedback on it and give them enough time to sort of implement some things there. May end up doing it slightly different. The other option, and I'll just kind of fill this out and we'll talk about it. The other option is that we'll have a shorter in-class critique on Thursday, the 7th, and we will focus on the feedback you get from, basically what we'll do is we'll have an in-class critique on the 7th. You will post your project also to Sync Sketch, and instead of us having as long of an in-class critique, you can get your notes through Sync Sketch as well, right? So you'll get a couple of takeaway notes that people can help you remember the things to comment on. So I don't know, I'm sort of toying around with both of those ideas. The reason I like that for this one is because there's that week of spring break, and that means you could always turn in a revision if you wanted to the Tuesday after you get back from spring break, if you're planning on doing some work on this. Some of you may be planning on sitting on a beach somewhere, sipping beach-related drinks. Yes?
Did you say you were going to do a video for the...
I did. I am a dirty liar. No, I'm halfway through them. Not really an excuse, but that was the other thing I was going to address. I didn't get all the grades in for actual grades in time. And that's because a lot of stuff came up on Thursday and Friday I did not expect. And I know, that's not an excuse. I'm trying to make sure I get you all feedback, but at the same time, this thing would also benefit you significantly, and so I want to make sure I'm addressing that as well. So I will be getting you videos on that. I would like to do that tomorrow. I'm going to try to work on that tomorrow. I think what I've done today will free me up to be able to do some of that. And so you should be able to get the videos on those pretty soon. If that's holding you back from making your revision, though, we'll have a little bit of time after class today that I can sit down with you. I actually have like some of them finished for this class, probably about half of them. I've recorded a video for, and I just haven't uploaded it. So I will hopefully get those done very soon, though. And I'll get the actual grades into D2L as well. So most of you all noticed that the grades that came out for early semester progress reports, do you all get those? Have you already got those? Okay. So basically, instead of having a letter grade, because most of the things I had graded were the exercises, like for the most part, like D2L right now to me says 100, 100, 100, 100, 100, 26, 100, 100, 26, 100, and I'm like, that doesn't tell you anything about how you're actually doing in this class because the big project, it hasn't gotten substantial grading. So I just put either the pass or fail grade in there, and in fact, some of you, even though yours says 26, I saw that you've turned in something for project 1 that means that's going to substantially raise that grade. And so even if B2L is showing you as like in a failing grade, that's just because we haven't put that in there. So you probably still got the P instead of the F. My thinking there is that is saying if you continue on the progress you're at right now, you have a good chance of passing the class. Right? Not necessarily, you are definitely passing the class. The weird thing about, I really wish those early semester progress reports were like right after spring break, because then you have 2 projects turned in and you get a better idea of where you're at. So I can check in with you at that point to give you more feedback if you'd like, or give you more information about your grade if you'd like. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to mention is under course home, I dropped these there the other day, and I don't remember if I emailed you. Did I email all of you about this as well, or just post this on the sent the email to, okay, cool. I couldn't remember if I emailed you that. This was really, 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 really cool. Kenny Roy just released all of his videos for free. They used to be $10 each. So effectively $3,500 worth of videos are free now. I've bought several of them. They're really good. He is a professional at this. I'm pretty sure he used to work at Blue Sky, I think DreamWorks, and maybe Disney. I'm not sure about Blue Sky. I know DreamWorks for sure. He owns his own animation company now, and he's just incredible at this stuff. And he released a whole lot of really awesome videos, like to the point that I could very easily be like, every day in class your lecture is to watch a specific video. Like he released an entire animation course for free is what he just did. I encourage you to stop watching whatever it is you're watching on YouTube and watch this instead. It's especially if character animation is what you're wanting to do. I promise you this is some incredible stuff. Some of the ones I could recommend, I put some up here for the technical ones, like the FKIK switching and the constraints, because people already asked questions about that. A lot of the questions you'll have, he goes over in there, how to add more overlapping action. He also does an animation technique that works pretty well if you want to focus on timing, that he calls animating with tempo. And it's an animation technique that he kind of invented. That works really well to get some really strong timing. I don't think it would be the way I would teach somebody to start animating, but watching how he works with that is really good. So it's to the point that I feel like I need to stop class and say, you should go watch those. They're really, really good. The last one thing I'll mention, these 2 days here, Tuesday and Thursday. Yes, okay, I'm correct. So Tuesday and Thursday of week 8, so that's the 5th and the 19th. We double check and make sure I'm telling you the right times. Sorry, March. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong things. March 7th and 8th, which is the Thursday and the Friday. That's portfolio reviews. So I don't know if anybody is in portfolio in this class. In the other section, there are several people who are in portfolio. How many of you have been to portfolio reviews before? Okay. How many of you have never been to a portfolio review before? Okay. I strongly encourage you to do that. These are really cool. Basically what it is the last thing you have to do before you can graduate. You need to see what that looks like before you get into that class. So much so that I'm going to give you extra credit if you go. Okay? It won't be a lot of extra credit, but basically I'll take whatever it is your lowest grade is at the end of the semester, and I'll add like 1 point to one of the categories. That's effectively probably 3 or 4 points on your overall grade if it's an A to B or a 0 to 100 grade.
What's the portfolio review again?
So that's what I wanted to look at. That week there, week 8, so it's the week right before spring break. It's Thursday and Friday, and on Thursday it's 5:15 to question mark. So like after most of the classes are over, 5:15 p.m. And then on Friday, we're doing this a little bit different. On Friday, it's 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. So I know that's a weird one. So in the past, we've done it on Tuesdays and Thursdays because that's when the actual meeting time is. But we realized that like sometimes that means people have to work after class and they can't come to them. So we try to do some in the mornings, and we used to do that in the final portfolio review. Now we're trying it in the midterm portfolio review as well. So there are 2 different review dates. There's the one right before spring break, and that's their midterm review. That's like their halfway point. Let's see the early presentation, right? And then we watch that, we give them lots of feedback, and sometimes it's really good, and sometimes it's really, really bad. And like, I need you to see both of those. I need you to see the ones that go really well, and I need you to see the ones that are disasters, because then you will get it in your head which of those you want your presentation to be. So the midterm portfolio reviews are week 8, right before spring break. If you can't make those, we have another set on week 15, right before finals week, and that's going to be on Thursday and Friday as well. So the Thursday date is night after class, and then since most of us have lab days on Friday, we're going to do the Friday classes in the morning, so like 9 a.m. to probably 2 or 3. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30 students presenting. I don't have the presentation order yet, but I know that we have a lot of animators in there too. So yes.
Can you give us those times one more time?
Yes, on Thursday, sorry, I'm really bad with this. On Thursday the March 7th, will be 5:15 until we're through with the first set. It usually goes to probably about 9 o'clock, something like that. And then Friday will be 9 a.m. until we're done with the rest of them. And hopefully that is not 5 o'clock. Like hopefully it'll be like a little after lunch we can be finished.
Which room are they? Where do you usually have them?
We usually have them over in the Millennium Center. So we borrow one of those rooms and we have it in there. It'll either be in one of the big conference rooms, probably won't be in one of the big conference rooms. I think there's classes in there at times. So it'll probably be in one of those rooms down the end hall. But what we usually do is hang up a piece of paper that day that has a map that shows you where to go. But it's over in the Millennium Center in one of those rooms. So, any other questions on this? Again, I strongly encourage you to come check them out and see some of see how they go, right? Because eventually you're going to have to do these too. All right. So here's my run. I'm going to go ahead and set this, make sure I'm playing back at real time. So this is where I'm at right now. All this is my keyframes, my key poses for my run cycle. So I'm a little bit ahead of you. I intentionally did this because, frankly, it's boring to watch me animate, right? Like you don't want to have to watch me create all of these poses. But this is not finished by any means, but you should be able to get the idea of kind of what I'm going for on mine. I'm going to show you some stuff about these poses and how they relate to the walk animation. So most of you have probably had to do a walk animation before, right? How many of you had to do one of those in like the principles class, right? I know some of you probably ended up doing one in animation fundamentals as well. So you've probably heard a lot of keywords that I'm going to be saying today, right? Let me go find I got out of my folder. So, be VLC, always use this option. So here is a walk animation, or a walk, right? This is actually just something I stole from YouTube, because I'm a YouTube thief. I wonder if YouTube is actually going to hear me say that and then take my video down. They'll probably.
From your hard drive?
From my hard drive. Well, I'll upload this eventually. So, so this is from a website called something Endless Reference, or a YouTube page called Endless Reference. It actually used to be a company that sold these videos, but they shoot this just so you can kind of use it as reference. And for each of these, there's usually like a slow motion version of it as well with a grid, so you can kind of see some stuff. Now this one has maybe a little bit of a personality to it, but the thing I wanted to talk about is a walk cycle is made up of 4 key poses. Does anybody remember what those poses are?
Contact passing.
Contact. What was the?
Contact passing.
Well, yeah, you're missing one more. It's the opposite of up. Down. So contact, down, passing, and up. You all remember, I've probably heard me say this before. If you haven't, you will recall this image here from the, this is from the Animator Survival Kit. Now it's not the end-all be-all reference, but it's the one that you'll find the most. There's a couple of little things in here I kind of disagree with, but not drastically. Like I think the down and the up poses are a little too exaggerated, but it lets you clearly see what they are, right? Our contact pose is the last and first point our feet are contacting the ground, right? That's where our front foot is contacting, where our back foot is pushing off and getting ready to lose contact. The thing you will notice, and this is really important, is your arms are doing the opposite of what your legs are doing, right? If your right leg is forward, that means your right arm is backward, or pointing backwards. Right? So these key poses exist because they contain information that is necessary to be able to actually walk. Right? This is one of the few times where your key poses are not something that's just left up to your creative decision. You can add a layer of creativity on here, but without all 4 of these poses, walking is physically impossible. These are the 4 poses that actually all locomotion share. So if I were running sideways, if I were skipping, if I were practically if I'm doing a hop, there is a contact, a down, a passing, and an up. Right? So the down pose is where we absorb that weight from the contact pose. Our hips are at its lowest point in that pose, and you'll see that our back foot is already sort of pushed off, and since it was pushing backwards as well with friction, it kind of kicks up behind us. The other thing you'll notice is that your arms kind of flail out just a little bit, and if you think about that, if you were holding your arms like this, and then your hips suddenly dropped a little bit, your arms are going to kind of umbrella out and then follow through. Right? And so that's kind of what's happening on the down. They actually kind of overshoot just a little bit on that down pose. Again, I think it's exaggerating a lot of that. But this is the lowest point your hips and your head will be in the entire walk cycle. So that's another reason it's very important. It's also the point where now your front foot is the support for your weight. Right? Now, as your hips continue to move forward, right, you're eventually standing on one leg. Now, this is the one we could actually maintain if we tried. Like, this is the only pose that is really in balance. If I am standing on one leg, though, I have to shift my weight over that leg. Right? So that means in a walk cycle, your character's hips are doing this. Right? They're shifting back and forth over the leg. Right? So that one is completely imbalanced, and you'll notice the reason we call it the passing pose is because your leg is passing, going forward, And both of your arms are sort of passing by your side as they swing back and forth, right? This is somewhere around the same height as your contact pose, maybe a little higher. Really kind of depends on what you're going for on the walk. Now your up pose is the highest point you will ever be. And again, I think they kind of exaggerate it. They have him going way up on his tiptoe. You do go up a little bit on your tiptoe, probably not quite that much. But the reason we do that is because we're trying to buy just a little bit more time for our foot to get out there in front of us and catch us. Right? A phrase that I really like to use to think of a walk cycle is that it's a perpetual fall forward. Right? So if I'm standing on one leg and I start to fall forward, I have to catch myself with that other leg. And that's my next contact pose, is catching myself, right? The up pose is me going up just a little bit to buy myself a little bit more time to throw my leg out there in front of me to catch myself, right? I really like to think of this whole process, if you look from just the hips down, it's kind of like a repetitive tiny pole vault, right? I'm pole vaulting over one leg, pole vaulting over the next leg, right? And so that's kind of what we're going to get, this arc in the hips, and we're going to get sort of that, like, we're pushing ourselves over our front leg, right? We get that front leg out in front of us. I have to launch myself over that front leg with forward momentum. So your arms are going to swing countering. Now here's the interesting thing. These 4 poses, that's only a half of a walk, right? That's only one step. So we need 4 more on the mirrored version of this to get back to our beginning pose, the contact pose, right? So no matter how you want to sort of cut this, like this is a full cycle on a more exaggerated character, but you still see that we get that contact, they call it recoil, your passing pose, your up, your high point, back to your contact, and then the whole thing repeats again, and you'll notice our first and last pose is the contact pose, right? Those 2 poses have to be exactly the same. So if I go back and look at my character, you'll notice that my contact pose, well, we'll start here. This is my contact pose, right? And my next contact pose is there. Right? So those 2 have to be the same. I'm actually looping a different section. I'm going from passing to passing. And the reason for that is my passing pose is the pose that is most similar to my idle pose. My contact pose, like, her legs are like way out there, right? And her idle pose, they're neutral and on the ground. So I want the shortest transition from my idle to my run as possible, so it's not this big change every time. Right? So, right there. So let's look at this in slow motion. Contact down, passing up. Contact down, passing up. So just kind of watch those little bits at a time, and we can kind of see them. I'll try to pause them on it. So contact. Right? We see all of those elements we were talking about. Down, where his foot took the weight and he's pushed off with the back foot. Passing, where all of the limbs are passing. Up. Maybe just back a frame on this for up, right? And if we watch his head, we'll see his head does go through that cycle. Now, there is I feel like it's important to recognize that this is how motion works, right? This is how locomotion works. So even though she's doing it with a slightly different personality to it, like she's swinging her arms less and it feels a little bit more casual or confident, she's a different body type, right? She has different anatomy. All of these things are still there. In fact, all these things are there on other animals too. If you look at how a horse walks, contact down, passing up, right? All of those things are there because those are the 4 poses that are necessary to keep you from falling down and smacking your head on the coffee table like you were doing when you were like 8 months old trying to learn to walk, right? Learning to walk is learning all of those motions. Eventually, we get really good at them and they seem really smooth, right? But those key elements are all there. Now, I do think it's, and I've kind of mentioned this before in other classes, there are ways that we can, we'll just continue on and I'll talk about this. All of these things are the essentials to that locomotion. But your character's personality is something that you would layer on top of that, right? So there's a contact pose, which has absolutely no personality to it at all, right? But what does a sad contact pose look like, right? Are you like drooping your head? Are you a little bit more slouched? What does a confident contact pose look like? What does an angry contact pose look like? All of those things are things that we just layer on top of those poses, right? So this is got its own personality to it. Feels a little down or disappointed, maybe, or just tired, right? Maybe that's just the backpack that makes me go, she's probably been in class all day. She just wants to get back to the dorm, eat some ramen noodles, and take a nap. Right? But whatever that is, like this is still the same 4 poses. Contact down, passing up. Right? And so we're going to find these all throughout any locomotion. Now again, this is something we have talked about in the past. Like we can start adding different things about the emotion in here. So just from watching this, how are you reading this emotion state of mind? How's he feeling?
Tired.
Tired, yeah. Like maybe defeated. It's definitely sluggish, right? I think this one is listed as exhausted. Exhausted, large male, slow motion, which was my nickname in high school. It took a long time for people to chant that at me. So here's something I do think is worth looking at, and I'll be honest, it's loaded terms that I'm going to use here. So there is a difference in locomotion that is generally perceived as male and generally perceived as female. Now, I just recognize that, like, again, those 2 words are based off of like how society labels those things, right? So you can totally be a male who doesn't walk in this way that adheres to those ideas. But generally, when we think of masculine or when we think of feminine, there are differences in the way that the anatomy works. So notice him, right? He is taking these very wide steps, like his feet are far apart when they hit the ground, right? So like his feet are just generally, there's more of a distance between them. There are some anatomy reasons for that, and there are some like weight reasons for that. Usually the distribution of weight, males to females, is a little different, usually a little higher on males, like broader shoulders. And so because of that, that means he shifts his weight a lot when he walks. Like look how much side-to-side motion he shifts when he walks. And that's because he has to get his feet or his weight over each foot, right, to do that. Now, on top of that, there are the personality or emotional like things that we're laying on top of this. The way his arms just feel sort of like they're dangling, like they're kind of moving without a lot of intention. The way his line of action is kind of curled forward and his head's looking down. And just sort of the way that if you look at his contact pose, doesn't hit way out there in front of him. It's like he barely gets it underneath him in time to catch himself from falling, right? So that's what we're looking at here in this situation. Now, to kind of compare that back to the, this is angry female, right? And so, again, all of these things are still there. Contact down, passing up. There are small, subtle clues about why she's angry, or how there are small, subtle clues that tell us that she is angry. She's got clenched fists. She swings her arm, most of her arm swing is from the elbow, but she keeps her shoulders a little, like her upper arm isn't moving as much, it's mainly in her forearms, right? And there's something very stiff about the leg motion too, right? It's very, like she's stomping, right? And those are clues that we get for the emotional part of this. But again, like, and there's a lot of studies from this. We can read these clues of, like, even if you couldn't tell anything about her, if this animation was on a mannequin that exhibited no gender at all, right? It was like completely neutral. You would still read this as slightly feminine. And some of those issues, or some of the reasons we're seeing that, is notice that her feet are hitting closer together. So those are contacting, and it's a little more like she's walking a narrow line. Right? If you push it to the extreme of that, like a runway walk for a model, like they really do walk like they're walking a tightrope, like they put one foot in front of the other and swing them out. Part of this again is anatomical and sort of weight distribution reasons, right? So women generally have slightly larger hips, or more weight in their hips, reproduction reasons. And that means that like big weight shifts, just like it's easier to just rotate your hips when you're walking in a straight line than it is to do like big weight shifts. And so we read that as slightly more hip motion, that means slightly more contrapposto, right? And the feet being a little closer together, right? Recognize that your character can be anywhere in a spectrum of this, right? There's nothing that says that that your character like was labeled male on the file I gave you, and so that means you have to make that character do a stroke, right? Like everybody falls somewhere on a different part of that spectrum and how that they would move, right? And so I'm just showing you this to show you that that is a slider you can adjust on your character, right? You want to make a let's say you have a character that is an adorable little girl in a pink Easter dress, and you want to make her really angry and like tough, then you can do that walk cycle much closer to that masculine side, like she's just coming to like get into a fight, right? And so like there's nothing wrong with like messing around with that. Nothing wrong. Like think of this as a tool for you to leverage in order to get the performance you want for a very nuanced character. If your character is a cliche, then you may just fall like in a very predictable area. Use this as a slider to make your character feel nuanced, right? So we've been talking about walks for a long time here, and you're probably asking yourself, why? We don't have to animate a walk. We have to animate a run, right? That's not necessarily true. I listed it as run just because usually you want your character to be able to get from one location to another pretty quickly. But if you decided to do a walk, that's fine. Like your character can walk around the scene, just recognize they'll be moving a little slower in your scene. You'd have to lower your move speed down. The reason we're talking about walks is because that's the one we see the most. That is the locomotion events that we see in the world the most, right? Walking back to your dorm today, walking back to your car, wherever, you're going to see dozens of them, right? You watch people walk all the time. And because of that, that means even though that's often one of the first character animations people ever do, it's one of the hardest. You will do so many walk cycles in your life. It's the point to where now when I get a rig, I'll just start doing a walk cycle on it to see if I like the rig, right? I have lost count of the number that I've done. You will too. And they are some of the hardest things to get right because everybody is a wonderful critic of walk cycles, right? Everybody knows what a walk should look like intuitively. Whereas you may not necessarily know what a flying dragon should look like. And so if something has some variation in there, it's all right. Like it still looks close enough to right to most of our eyes, right? But we all see so many walks that they are hard to get right. Like they're real. Like any little thing that feels off just pokes us in the eye, right? It's like, oh, what is wrong with their shoulders? Something weird's happening in their shoulders, right? So the thing we see probably the next most in locomotion, though, is a run. And it's important to recognize that locomotion is locomotion. A run has the same poses. We have a contact, a down, a passing, and an up. Now, there are a couple of other key elements that have to hit in there, right? Like our up pose and our other contact. You'll notice that both of those, the feet are on the ground, but pose number 6 there, or image number 6, that one is up in the air. And that's important, because if your character, the main difference between a walk and a run is with a run, there is one pose where both feet are off the ground, okay? That's why you can't just take a walk animation and make it faster and make it look like a run. That's why speed walking is a different event than jogging or running, right? For it to be a run, there has to be a point where both feet are off the ground. And because of that, you could actually start to think of a run as a bouncing ball, right? A run is, the contact is the stretching point, the down is the squash, the passing, or this up pose here, right? That is the stretch, right? And this pose number 6 is that point where your ball is up in the air, right? And so like a run is kind of just like a bouncing ball going to that sequence over and over again. We can skip to the next image and see again, all of those poses are in there, contact down, passing up. One of the things I think is important to remember on the contact, I usually try to get the leg relatively straight, and that's both in the run and the walk. For some reason, I feel like this is weird because he's not on his contact pose, he's landing kind of bent kneed, but I think that this is because he is running super fast, right? Which means he doesn't have time for the down. The interesting thing about this, if you look at a jog, your character has a lot of up and down motion. If you look at an Olympic sprinter, they don't. And what that means is that they have managed to become efficient enough at running that they're not losing any energy to the up and down motion. It's all going to the forward motion. And like their head just looks like it's a perfect straight line as it goes across. So there's some juggling you can do there to make the run seem faster or more like a half jog, half run, right? So again, we can see a lot of these things. I just slowed this video down so you can see contact, down, passing, up. Oh, that's coming from me. I'm like, why is this thing playing music? I was like, I thought somebody was like unplugged their Spotify for some reason. So you're seeing these things happen in each of these poses. So the last thing we'll look at is some slow motion reference on this. Again, see where the foot contacts. A couple of little issues that I see both in a run and walk is that when your foot hits the ground, it goes flat pretty quickly, like probably not 1 frame, but probably 2. It will go from being back on the hill to completely flat. Sometimes your keyframes are 4 or 5 frames apart, and so if that foot goes flat over 5 frames, it makes it feel really soft, right? So, and they just threw a backflip in there for good measure. Why not? So let's see if this one, like watch her as she gets faster, you'll notice that her head doesn't move up and down very much. And even this, even though she's jumping, her head isn't moving up and down very much. Okay. I guess a couple of other things worth kind of noting on a run. In my run cycle that I'm using, she's hitting on her heel first. Most people are really inefficient at running, and when you hit on your heel first, you lose a little bit of that forward energy, right, forward momentum. But that's actually still how most people just naturally run. If you're training to run faster, notice that this guy at the end here, right here, notice he's landing on his toe right there. And that's because if you land on your heel, it slows you down just a little bit on each step. And if you're landing on your toe, you'll go faster. I would say that you'll use that as a creative decision. Are you wanting your character to seem like an Olympic sprinter or like a normal person who's running and has never been like trained by a physical trainer on how to run more efficiently, right? So that's just a bunch of stuff I have about running. Let's look really quickly at my character and her run. So I'm seeing little things, like I think there's a chance that this pose out here is a little too big, so I'll probably pull that leg back just a little bit. So let me go ahead and do that now. But I want to show you through the poses that I'm using right now, which is passing. This is what I'm calling my up. Or I'm sorry, yeah, this is my up. No. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of stealing some different things from this. And you're welcome to use this, but recognize you kind of have to go through all 7 of these motions. So the ones I used was sort of this, I'm sorry, this is passing, but it's also sort of the down point. This is where the character is pushing off the ground, right? This is her up in the air, so this is the highest point for me that she'll get. This is the contact again, and then back to the passing. And yeah, now that I'm seeing this, I definitely need to lower this a little bit. So we can kind of find a happy medium point here. And here. There we go. It's feeling a little bit better. It's a pretty big stride she has here, right? So I wanted to show you a couple of things that are useful in editing this run after you have these keyframes. The first is, I've already kind of shown you briefly, but I'm going to show you how to use it in here. What I've done is I've just taken these keyframes and I'm going to delete all of the rest of the animations in this file, right? So all I want is my run cycle in this file. And the way I can do that, select everything, extend my timeline out, and basically everything from 500 to wherever, I'm just deleting all of those keyframes. It's really important to remember that to have, wait, let me get this here. So my game exporter, I can go back to my run. And so now I have 500 through 524. Again, it's really important to remember that my start frame and my end frame have to be exactly the same. So if I go back and forth between my first frame and my last frame and anything changes, then that's a problem. That's going to feel like a hitch when we loop. So once I have all this, I'll go to the animation menu. And this is where we're going to kind of experiment around with how to make this flow a little bit better. So I'm going to extend my timeline out just a little bit on each side of it. I'll go ahead and frame this up so I can see it. There we go. Grab all my curves. I want to make sure I have a keyframe on everything too. Like make sure that there's one on every one of these poses. I'm not sure that was actually the case. There we go. So there's a keyframe on all of those poses. And then under View, I'm going to set this to infinity, which we already have that turned on. Without infinity turned on, you'll see it like this. But if we go to View, Infinity, we'll see that for any of these curves I select, right, at the end of that curve, it just stays flat. At the beginning of that curve, it stays flat. What I really want is for every one of these to just cycle on repeat forever. And so the way we do that is under Curves, Pre-Infinity Cycle, and Curves, Post-Infinity Cycle. That means if I stretched out my timeline here, my character is actually going to run in a cycle forever, right? You can see even where I don't have keyframes here before and after it, it still just continues to play that curve that happens before and after. Now this is where sort of the editing for this begins. Okay, the reason I do this, and again, I polish these in the same order. I start with the hips, I do the feet, I go up the spine. I'm doing the same splining process, right? So the reason I do this is so I can see how it flows from the beginning to the end of each of these. So if I grab this, start with my Translate X, you'll see a few things here. Right? So my Translate X is, let's figure out what that is. It is my side-to-side motion, right? Now notice what happens if my keyframes are not aligned. Like if this one's a little higher, notice how it doesn't flow right back into that curve. Right? But since they're aligned, we're okay. So we'll notice what happens is the character moves forward to the center and then kind of back over and then over to there. So that means I think this curve is a little bit off. And so I can go through here. And what you're going to start to notice in your graph editor is a pattern, right? We have a cycle. So when she's here, that's the lowest point. And when she's in the mirrored pose, that's the highest point in that curve, right? So this is, again, just our Translate X. This is the side to side. But if you have something that seems out of place in that, like this, then you're like, why is that doing that? Like, that means there's something that changes that is not symmetrical, right? So you're not going to be trying to make this perfectly symmetrical, but you should start seeing a pattern, right? If I go to my Translate Y, that's the up and down bounce, right? That's her up and down of her hips. And we should be able to see that. The lowest point, our passing pose in this case, we hit that three times, the beginning, the end, and that one in the middle, right? And the highest point, we hit twice, right? So if we had something that looked kind of wonky in this, like this, then we'd be like, something's not right. Why is that happening, right? Now keep in mind, we can still make changes to this that change that, right? Like if I wanted her to feel like she sort of hung in the air a little longer before coming down like this, maybe I would grab this key and sort of raise that up a little bit. And that's going to make this hit a little harder on that, right? So now her stomp is just a little harder. Right? But the big thing I want you to notice is that my curves are flowing into each other. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and keep that. I kind of like that. My curves are flowing into each other pretty well, right? I don't have anything that looks like this, right? Which is going to cause a weird hiccup at that loop point. You'll start to see areas where I do though. Like my translate Y or Z, I'm not really having her do too much forward and back. Here we go. Here's something that's nice and broken for us. So how do we fix this? How do we figure out what this is supposed to be? So this is her rotate X. This is her forward and backward motion. And so what I've actually got going on here is I have her rotating backward just a little bit here as she's coming down, right? I wanted it to look like it's kind of dragging behind a little bit. So if I wanted this to continue to make a pattern, maybe I would do something like this. Now you'll see what happens at my loop point here is it flattens out. So that means I have to kind of keep that flowing smoothly. That little trick right there, keeping that flowing smoothly from the beginning and the end of my curve, is going to make your cycle actually cycle. If you don't do that, what's going to happen is at the end of every one of your run cycles, you're going to get this little hesitation at the loop point. Right? So that wasn't a big deal, but we're going to start to see others that maybe are a little bit more of a big deal. So yeah, these are working pretty good. And so that little bit of change didn't make a huge difference, but it made a little bit of a difference on what my character is doing. Again, my workflow, I do the hips, or I do the center of gravity, I do a pass on the feet. I can see an error on the feet right there. See this? So we got this, like, that foot is right there, and it kind of flattens out in that curve. So I could just sort of make this flow a little better. Now this is my rotate X, which means this is how my character's foot rotates forward. So maybe I'll go in here and play with this and see if is there anything I could do that smooths that out. Turns out I kind of like that. And then right here though, that feels a little stiff. So maybe I would continue to push out like that. You'll start to see little areas where we can fix loop points. The arms sometimes have these, so you'll see here, that's not flowing very smoothly. We'll want that to flow a little smoother. But that's not the only thing I'm fixing. I may also, like, you'll see that her backward motion on that arm kind of goes flat there. I may go ahead and just push that a little bit, right? Maybe I'll go ahead and keep this feeling a little more. Now, here's something that's actually, I want to show you a couple of little tricks here. So here's something that's kind of neat. If we wanted to offset the arms, if I were just limited to frames 500 through 524, I couldn't do that, right? But this is really neat. I can now because I have this cycling. What I cannot do, like 500 to 524 means I have 25 frames, right? If we're counting 0, or 500, 501. So we have 25 different frames here, right? That's the length of my run cycle. So as long as I don't make any of these sections of the body, if I don't make their motion longer or shorter than 25 frames, I can shift those in the timeline. So if I wanted her arm to happen at a slightly different time, I could grab all of these keyframes and shift that a frame later. I just shifted her entire arm animation one frame later. Let me just show you with all of the arm keys, just so it makes more sense. Grab all of these, shift them one frame later. And so here's the interesting thing. Now her arm animation happens from 501 to 525 instead. But 500 still has that curve continuation, right? So really, since I have this on cycle, I never see any break in that cycle. And so this will allow us to offset stuff, right? Now you have to be a little careful with that. I would save before you do that, because if you accidentally do something like grab this keyframe and just slide it, now my animation is not 25 frames long, it's 27 frames long. And eventually that cycle is going to mess up, and you'll start to see her arms start to not make sense, right? So you have to be careful with that. But you can do it a little bit in certain spots. So here's the last thing. I think this is a really neat trick. It's not a trick, right? But it works pretty well. Let's say you knew that your character inside of Unreal is moving 600 units a second, right? Well, here's how we can make her feet line up with that. So I'm going to grab this placement control, and I'm going to delete all of the keyframes out of the middle here. Delete. Actually, I'll just delete this last one too. And then I'm going to go out here to frame 30, because it should be, well, I guess I would have to go to frame 29, wouldn't I? Because it's actually 30 frames a second. So from frame 500 to 529 is exactly 100, or is exactly 1 second. So if she's moving 600 units a second, and that's going to be in translate Z, I should just be able to type in 600 right there. And now she moves to there. Now, if I go look at my curve for translate Z now, it's that. Right? And how this will play is this repeating run forward back to the beginning thing, right? Because it's cycling. What I wanted to do instead of cycling is cycling with an offset. So right now, once it gets to the end of this frame, 529, right? It just goes back to 0, back to 500 again. What I wanted to do is I wanted to continue, that curve continue to climb up. So what I'll do is grab that translate Z and go to curve, pre-infinity, cycle with offset, curve, post-infinity, cycle with offset. And so now, she will run into frame and out of frame. Now you'll see those little hesitations that are happening at the beginning and the end. That's because those tangents are flat. So if I select those and set those to linear, now she's going to run right by us. So I can adjust this. There are two different ways this could work, right? I could, if I have control over the way this motion happens in Unreal, which you do, I can control my run speed in Unreal. But most likely it would happen in the other direction. The designers would say the character has to run at 600 units a second, and you have to make the run look correct for that. So the way we can see if that's happening, particularly through this center point right here, is if I go look at her foot, right? Look at where her foot contacts right there, right? You'll see that it continues to slide forward. And so that's what we're talking about when we say foot slide, right? It appears to sort of contact the ground right about in there, and when it leaves the ground, it's here. Right? So to me, 600 units a second is a little fast for the run cycle I've animated. The way we can find out how this should look is I could go in here, select this, hit R, and just kind of scale that down. Let's actually just select the second one, hit R, and just scale that toward this point here. So let's make it a little slower and see if that looks a little better. So a little bit. But actually, I'm going to undo that because there's something else that may be causing it to slide. If I grab this control here, my Z-axis is this forward and backward motion of my foot, right? My foot hits the ground. It appears to hit the ground right about here, at the top of this, right? And then it should just travel in a straight line, but we got some wonky stuff happening here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of clean up this curve a little bit. I'm going to delete this curve. And then I'm going to go here to this, and I'm going to set this tangent to linear. And I'll set this tangent to linear. And I'm going to try to adjust this keyframe in the middle so it kind of flows in a straight line. And so now this progression from here to here is a perfectly, it's really probably more there, wasn't it? I deleted the wrong key. There we go. It really needs to be to there. That one should be a, there we go. That one should be a straight line. So I can take this now, kind of make that go in a straight line, maybe make this one go in a straight line. And that should get a little bit more of an accurate foot slide. So basically what's happening is the point in which I contact the ground, it's going to move at a more steady pace to the point of where it leaves the ground, right? And so now that's moving linearly, and so is this placement controller. Now this will make a little bit more sense on the other foot, right? Because its translate Z is a little clearer. It hits the ground there, it leaves the ground there. Sort of zoom over here, we can see it, right? And so that means that these two should be linear, and then this one we could just delete it. So that's a perfectly straight line. And so basically what's happening is that straight line is happening at the same or the opposite rate in which this curve is moving forward. I know this is kind of convoluted. You may have to go back and kind of rewatch this to make sense. But basically what you want is as the placement controller is moving forward, you want that foot to hit the ground and travel backwards in the at the same rate in the opposite direction. So then it looks like your foot is staying perfectly still. Now we could do some math and figure out what that rate is, but we can often just sort of adjust this, this placement controller's animation a little bit to get a better result. So I could grab this in key, just start moving it backward, and see what happens when the foot hits the ground now. So now there's less sliding. See that? It's not no sliding, but it's less. There we go. So that's feeling much better to me. It's maybe not perfect. Let's say there. Now, how we can find out what the number needs to be in Unreal is just to select this. And we see it's 373.29. Let's try 375 instead. And when we watch this animation now it doesn't feel like our feet are sliding around underneath her as much. Okay? So that's how we can adjust that. Now when I go into Unreal, I would change my run speed to 375. Now again, the way that would usually work in a studio is that they would give you a number and you would have to make your run match that speed. And that's a little more complicated. It really has to do with your stride length and how fast your feet are moving underneath you. So to export this out, I'll just go ahead and select this, hit delete. So now she's going to run in a cycle there. I still have my game engine here. I'll uncheck everything except for the run. I'll hit export. Yeah, I want to replace it. Export successful. And now I'll go in here, right click on character run and say re-import. And when I hit play now, hopefully, yeah, now her run looks a lot better. Now again, we can't really see the foot sliding that much when this is on a gray environment. But if I go to the starter content, I'll put a material on here that makes it more obvious. Maybe something like, oh, let's try something less terrible. Well, that's big too. I can show you how to make that repeat. But now when she runs around on this, you'll see a little bit more like that is sliding. So what I would do is go to my third person blueprint. Under blueprints, I have to go to this character movement inherited, and I'll change my, right here, my walk speed to 375. Compile and save. So now when she runs, it's going to be slower in the game, but it's going to feel more accurate to how she's moving. Now, an interesting element of this is if I wanted her to seem like she's running faster, I could increase her stride length, right? So her feet have to travel further when they're on the ground. Or I could just increase the run speed. Right now mine's taking 25 seconds to or 25 frames to happen. I could try to make mine happen in 20 frames. At that point, her forward momentum would be a different speed, right? And then I could re-export it and change my run speed in here. So that's how we'll go back and forth to make that work. But you should be able to see now, like, she's not getting a terrible amount of feet sliding on this. She's still jumping really high. So I'll go to File, Save All. Go ahead and close this. I still have polish that I would do on this animation. I still feel like it needs to be loosened up in the arms a little bit. She needs more drag in the arms, overlapping action in the arms. And I personally feel like her run's a little slow. I would probably go ahead and speed it up and adjust my speed there. So I may tinker around with that here in a little bit. Questions? So the run is one of the ones that we're going to be able to notice looks wrong the easiest. So I expect that, like, in the past, it's always seemed that when people get a portfolio piece out of this project, it has a tendency to be their idle and their run, occasionally their punch. If you can get all four of them working, then it all sort of serves as one piece and you can just show the whole thing. But spend a lot of time on this run, try to make it look as good as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and shut up now, turn the rest of the class over to you. We have about 20 minutes left, so I'm sure some of you have some questions. Let me stop this video and upload it. And again, you have till the end of class to turn in the graph editor test as well. All right, rest of the class is yours.